It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to New Zealand, so thank you to Superu for the invitation. Thank you to you all for such a warm welcome. My parents did a round-the-world cruise to celebrate their retirement about 15 years ago, and they visited 30 different countries. And when they came back, I said, so which one would be the one country that you'd go back to? And without a blink, they said New Zealand. So I'm really pleased that I've managed to get here before I retire, which means I might actually get to come back and spend some more time here. So thank you. So what a build-up, what an introduction. So as Claire said, our centre, Dartington Social Research Unit, we're a charity, we're independent, and we're, I think, very like Superu in that we do try to make those connections between research, policy and practice. And we do believe that evidence has a role to inform decision making. It's one of the influences. I wouldn't say that evidence should be everything. And what I want to talk to you about today are our experiences in the UK. I think there are things that we can share with you, which if anything, it would be say, please don't do this, because we're not getting it right. And the context is there are some obvious similarities, but there are some clear differences. So I want to start by setting the context to give you a sense of what is going on in the UK, so you can see where things might be transferable and where things may not be relevant for New Zealand. I've divided my talk into 4 parts. So the first bit, very briefly, to set the context. I then want to spend a little bit of time talking about what works. This is a very live issue, clearly here. It's incredibly live back in the UK. There's some strengths and weaknesses to the approach that we're taking. I think there's huge opportunities. I feel that we're at a bit of a watershed when it comes to what works, and I'd like to set out what might be a vision for the next 10 years in that area. And then I want to end by taking a different approach to how we use evidence. So 4 chunks, and it would be really helpful to have sight of a clock, because I have no idea what the time is. Claire, can you give me a 5-minute warning?
Yep.
That would be great. I've got my clock here, but if you can just say 5 minutes to go, that would be really helpful. Okay. Yeah. So let's get started. Here we go. Right. One difference, I think, maybe, in the UK compared to New Zealand is our experience of austerity. The economic situation in Europe, even if you've been watching the news and hearing what's going on in Greece, is pretty severe. And we have a government that has embraced austerity in a big way, and the cuts to our public services are almost unimaginable. Local government has had about 30% of its budget cut over the last 5 years. So this has meant that we are having to think very differently about how we support children and families. If we're taking money out of the system, where are those services being cut? And it's hard to describe just how severe it is, and I hope that's not something you're going to have to go through, because it's pretty grim. When I look at the prospects for our children and our families in the UK, it's not a good situation. So we're grappling with austerity. We're also have a situation where I think because there's less money, there's also a drive to devolution. So some of you might have followed the Scottish referendum. Scotland, by a very slim margin, decided to stay in the Union, but it was close. And there is a move to devolve powers to the regions. So Scotland is getting more and more autonomy, as is Wales and Northern Ireland. And that's got a second round of devolution to our core cities. This is called the Northern Powerhouse, where Whitehall is giving up power and handing over budgets to the metropolitan cities. So we have a whole move of decentralisation and devolution. Our children can't be looking forward, I don't think, to a particularly happy retirement. I don't think kids will know whether they're going to get pensions, how long they're going to have to work till. So there's a whole sense of insecurity for the current generation is pretty large. We also have an issue around job insecurity. I think young people will have a very different experience of work than my generation is having. And also the prospect of owning their own home is pretty much an illusion for most young people. Home ownership is really going to be reserved for the very few. And to add on to that, we're giving our kids the legacy of lots of debt. I don't know how much that is similar. I'm seeing a few nods. Yeah, it's really grim, isn't it? I feel that my son's 13 and I look at the legacy we're creating for him and it does make me pretty sad. So this has had quite a consequence on how government are thinking, and one of those consequences is there's a real interest in what works and what's a good use of public money. So that's led to quite an investment in, oops, I've missed out one of my slides, I'll move on, in what works centres. So we have in the UK now about, I think, 6 or 7 What Works centres in these different areas. The 2 that are most relevant for children are here, the Education Endowment Foundation and the Early Intervention Foundation. Just serving similar functions to Superu, acting as a kind of a portal for trying to distill what we know about what works in these different areas. So it's a real signal by government that there is an interest in using evidence. How much that translates into policy decisions is probably a moot point, but the signal is there that there is an interest in what works. So what does this actually look like? Well, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of different online resources to try and guide people to where they can find out about what works. I've just put a handful up here. These 2 are American. This is our one at Dartington, Investing in Children. This is to show that Europe does make a contribution here. So we have the Netherlands and the Germany. But mainly, these What Works lists tend to be from the US. I added up how many online databases there were telling us what works, and the total came in at about 30, and the vast majority of those were from the US. So I'm sure that's something that is relevant for the New Zealand context, because where do you get your evidence from? Even if you cast the net internationally, I would imagine that the vast majority of evidence is actually from the US. So this is a big issue for us in Europe. To what extent is US evidence relevant for the decisions we're trying to make? So, all of these databases have got to have some way of deciding what goes on the list and what doesn't go on the list. There has to be some sense of setting a threshold, yeah? They can't all be setting the same threshold, otherwise the lists would look the same, and they don't. So we've thought a lot about this, and we've come up with this idea of what's called a standard of evidence. And this is kind of where you draw the line. Where is your threshold to determine that something is something can be labelled as what works, that it works? So we ask 4 quite basic questions. The first, oops, sorry, he's pushed the wrong button there. The first is, what is this thing that we're claiming works? Now, this might sound really obvious, and for those of you at the workshop yesterday in Auckland, this will be familiar to you. I read lots of research papers that have done really robust evaluations, and the thing that's quite often missing is the actual thing that was evaluated. What was it? What is it that I am being expected to replicate to try and get the same outcomes? So the first question we want to know is, well, what is this program, this intervention, this practice? So can I replicate this here and get the same effects? Second question, have you done the sort of evaluation that gives me confidence in the findings? So is this a few interviews with some families? Is this something very robust? Is this even an experimental evaluation where you have a comparison group? So I want really robust information that gives me confidence that the claims are reliable. I'd also like to know whether this thing does make an impact. We ask this question, what works, but actually it's a little bit misleading, because these programs tend to only work at achieving certain things. So what does it work at doing? So it's quite hard to label anything as working. It will work to perhaps improve behaviour or reduce recidivism or improve educational attainment. So what's the outcome? And this question, which is quite often overlooked, is this thing that you're telling me is really good and is going to work, can it be delivered in my public system, in my public services? So many of the things I come across are so clunky and packaged that they don't really work in our public systems. So this, I think, is a major challenge for us as we're trying to work out what does work and whether it's replicable. So this is just to take an example. I've just picked one random program off one of the lists. This actually, dysfunctional family therapy seems to pop up on most of these What Works lists, just to make the standards of evidence come to life. So first of all, what is it? This is an intervention which is quite well described. It's for young people who are involved in antisocial behaviour, getting disengaged from education, having difficulties at home. The intervention is very pragmatic. It's family therapists. They go into the home. They're trying to address what's going on in the home just to try and get things back on an even keel. This intervention has been evaluated several times by randomized controlled trials and found to have an effect on antisocial behaviour. And it seems to be quite well liked. It seems to be quite possible to pull it into a public system and to get it working. So it ticks all the boxes on the 4 questions on the standards. And we have it on our list for investing in children. So it gives you just a flavour of how you take an intervention and ask the 4 questions and decide whether or not it would meet the standard. We'll come back to, let me just check where I'm just going to skip onto the wrong slide. Let's see. Okay. I want to tell you just a little bit about investing in children, because I think this is slightly different from a lot of the other lists that you will find that give you an idea of whether something works. What we've decided at Dartington that seems to be missing is a sense of the economic case for a lot of these interventions, whether they're a good use of money. It's not sufficient any longer, particularly in the UK, to say, does this work? We have to say, does this work, and is it a good use of public money? And this is really a start, because this has not become the norm, I don't think, in the whole kind of what works discussion, to determine how much the cost is, and then to appraise in a conservative and consistent fashion what the economic benefit might be or not. So you can have a program that works, but it may not be a good use of public money. Okay. So just to give you a flavour, what our model does, it allows us to determine a unit cost and then to quantify what the economic benefit would be. So this is putting a monetary value on the outcomes that you can achieve. I don't want to go into the technical stuff because some of you will already have your eyes glazing over. All the technical stuff is on the website, investinginchildren.eu. But it looks at, if you have an intervention, for example, that affects antisocial behaviour, and that will, you could theorise, might reduce the chance of young people being drawn into the youth justice system, might increase the chance of them being able to stay in education. And all those things have a potential economic benefit, and we can put a value on that. So for this particular programme, the returns are very nice. They're about 31,000. Now this is not money that you're going to be able to put in your pocket. This is not money that someone who's running a service is going to say, great, that's a financial saving. These are economic benefits over the life course. But this one is a nice investment, and it's got a really low chance of a risk of loss. If you put your money in this, you've got a good chance that it'll make a difference and it'll be good for society financially. Not all programs are like that. If you look at this one at the top here, some of you might have heard of Scared Straight. I'll come back to it in a minute. Very cheap, only £55, but it's harmful. It's actually detrimental to kids. So you end up costing the state a lot of money by spending relatively small amounts on it, but over the life course is not a good investment. You get something like life skills training, is quite cheap, quite a nice return. Some other interventions, quite hefty, apparently expensive, but again, they seem to return quite nice benefits. And this one, you don't even quite break even. So this just provides a slightly different perspective on not only whether something works, but whether it's a good use of money. Very happy to take questions about that later, but I'm going to move on because the economics is not everybody's cup of tea. Okay. One of the big challenges for us in the UK is the extent to which we're willing to take on US evidence, because that's where so much of the evidence is. How relevant is it for a context that is quite different? And I would imagine this is a similar challenge for you. How different is your context so that you can actually make use of international evidence? So we were very fortunate. Birmingham City, which is one of the largest, it's the largest city in England outside of London, were willing to say, right, we're going to put some money into these evidence-based approaches, but we're not convinced that they're going to work in our context. Birmingham is very different, very ethnically diverse, and quite different from the context in America. So they said, right, we'll put the money in, but we want to find out whether they're making a difference. So they asked us if we would do 3 randomized control trials on 3 supposedly tried and tested interventions. And these are the 3. Some of you might have heard of them. I think Incredible Years is used in New Zealand. Triple P's from Australia. I think you use that as well. You might not have come across PATHs. These 2 are parenting programs. This one is a school-based program to promote social and emotional development. They are well tested in other contexts. So they should have given us the same benefits in the UK. So what happened? We did these 3 trials. Those of you who are into the methodology, that's all the nuts and bolts of how big the samples were, whether it was properly powered. They were nice, robust trials. The difference with them was that they were done very affordably, and they were trying to replicate what had been done elsewhere. So these are replication evaluations. Not the sexiest things to do. Journals don't really like publishing stuff like this. But really important to see whether you can get the same results. We did actually get it published, and those of you who are interested, the references at the bottom there. But let's see what we found. First up, I'm going to show you the results for Incredible Years. This is interested in whether behaviour can be improved with a parenting intervention. Okay, so a high score that means worse behaviour. So the lines are heading in the right direction. At the beginning, the behaviour was up here and it went down over time. We've got the results from the Incredible Years group and then our comparison group, which was the same in every way except they didn't get Incredible Years. So this difference here shows that Incredible Years had an extra value, had an extra impact over services as usual. This was significant, so we were able to say, we were able to repeat the effects that Incredible Years had in England that it had in the US. So this one got a thumbs up. Incredible Years was able to have the same impact in the UK as it had in the US. This is what happened with PATHS. We followed these kids for 2 years, and at the beginning, they were in the same situation. Things looked like they were heading in the right direction after 1 year, but after 2 years, things had actually got very, very marginally worse for the PATHS kids. It wasn't significant, so all we were able to conclude was, we haven't had an effect here. Really, this was a huge trial. This was 60 schools. 30 got the program, 30 didn't. So that was a pretty challenging result. And then we had our triple P. That was a really challenging result. Now, what was fascinating, at the same time, someone was evaluating this by just regular before and after measures. So they looked and went, well, this is great because things have moved in the right direction. It was only when we put the comparison group in, we thought, oh, actually, the comparison group actually would have improved at the same rate. So, really tricky. 3 programs, well regarded. 1, we got nice replication, and 2 seemed to leave us feeling rather, what does this mean? So we're left thinking, what happens when we import programs? What's going on here? Does this mean that we have to do all our homegrown? Have we got to start from scratch? Where should we go now in terms of using the What Works literature? Well, I looked more broadly beyond the 3 little trials that we'd done, and there are several American programs that have all been under randomized control trials at the moment. This study here is about to report in a month's time, a massive randomized control trial. We don't know what that's going to say. These 2 are homegrown, and with the exception of Incredible Years and MST, the results have been really, really ambivalent, not getting effects. So it's a really tricky sort of situation that we're in. And why is it? Why are we not getting the results? Well, first thing, is it to do with our context? Are our universal services and our welfare state so great that these programs can't add value? I don't think so, but there's obviously something to do with context. Is it the way we implement? Now, for Triple P, I'm absolutely sure that's the explanation. I wouldn't want any of you to take away a message that Triple P doesn't work. What happened in Birmingham is we were not able to implement Triple P particularly well. And as most of you will know, if you implement something poorly, you don't get the results. With PATHS, we know that was implemented really well. So it raises really difficult questions. We implemented it well. Perhaps just the business as usual was just as good. So that still leaves a question mark. Does it seem to make a difference when the developers are involved with these programs, when they're being evaluated? We do know that if you look at an evaluation where the person who's designed the intervention is also involved in the evaluation, they do seem to get better effects. I'm not suggesting that anything nefarious. I just think you're highly invested as a developer, aren't you? You want your program to work. You want to see people doing things well. And that might contribute to why we get slightly distorted results. Is there some other reason? We don't know. So yes.
Quick question.
Yes.
Those 3 trials referred to, were they any of them single-blinded or double-blinded?
No, they weren't single or double-blinded. No.
Thank you.
Okay. So there is a risk that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. I think a lot of people could see this and go, well, let's just forget it. Let's just go back to doing what we believe is right, what we know is right, and innovate at home. I really don't think that's the answer. I think that would set us back a long way. But it is causing us to have real sort of deep reflections on, well, to what extent can we take evidence from other contexts and use it in the UK? So what can we do? I know for a fact that one thing we could do is we stop doing things that we know are harmful, which is a slightly different tactic. I mentioned earlier on Scared Straight. This is a program that's American. This is something that has been evaluated several times by a randomized control trial and is consistently found to be harmful. It's about taking young people who are involved in antisocial behaviour, taking them to an adult prison for a day, having them shocked by the adult prisoners into how their wicked ways will land them in a difficult situation. That is harmful. Those young people who go to the prison end up more likely to get involved in antisocial behaviour. So let's stop doing stuff like that. What else could we do? I do think we have to give more attention to implementation. I think this is probably where we have got to learn more about what it is that was done under those circumstances of a trial, and what do we need to attend to when we're trying to replicate those effects. And to give you an example, something that's quite often overlooked when it comes to replicating programs or practices is who these are for. So we say what works, for whom? Most of these programs and interventions have been found to be beneficial to a particular population. We then take that program and we pay no attention to who it was intended for, and then we wonder why we don't get the results. So to give you just a little flavour of what that might look like, we tried to deliver incredible years in family centres, 6 different family centres. And we knew that this program was for families where the children had apparent conduct disorder. So a proportion of children. This wasn't a universal, this was targeted. So the challenge was, could those workers in the family centres reach out to those parents who had children who had those difficulties? And we knew from epidemiological data that we would expect this number in the community. So this is the catchment, 315 kids would have been in the age range for this family centre. And we estimated about this number would have had a conduct disorder. So the challenge was, how good were the family centres at reaching those kids? Well, this was the range. This children's centre down here really struggled to reach out to parents, to engage them into the programme. This children's centre here was incredibly skilled at it. They offered the same programme in the same way, but the big difference was their ability to reach out to the right families. I think we could put a huge amount of effort in improving our abilities to engage and reach out to families who need help. We talk about hard to reach families. It's hard to reach services. Yeah? Oh, that got a good nod. Okay, so what about the role of the practitioner? Over the years, I've heard lots of people say to me, forget about the evidence, it's all about the relationship. It's all about the ability of the practitioner to relate to the person who they're working with, because effectively they're the instrument of change. They're the people who are trying to bring about the change in behaviour. And I've always been a bit, However, more recently I've come to believe that there's really something in that. And this study that was done by the lovely people at the Washington State Institute helps to illustrate the point. So some of you will love a bar chart. Some of you can have a 2-minute zuzz, but let me walk you through what this is saying. This is actually back to FFT and the functional family therapy. So what you have here, these lines, are practitioners. Okay, and these are the recidivism rates for the practitioners who are delivering this program. So a higher bar is a bad thing because it meant there was a higher recidivism rate. So number 7 here had the highest recidivism rate for their caseload, and number 19 here had the lowest recidivism rate. If they didn't get the program, you'd expect recidivism to be at this level. These guys down this end delivered the program with low fidelity. So they didn't adhere to the model, they didn't follow, they maybe had the training but they didn't use it, they didn't follow the stages of the model. And these guys up here had high fidelity. They followed it as it was meant to be. I don't know what jumps out for you from that, but 2 things jump out for me is that you can get practitioner 19, who's doing the program really well and getting very low recidivism, but you can also get practitioner 1, who's doing the program not as it was intended, but still getting really nice effects. For me, that says something about the ability of a practitioner to relate well to a client and to be able to bring about change. However, this amount of variation means that we've potentially got practitioners who are making things worse. So if you can harness those good talents of good relationship building and put it into some sort of structure of a program, what you can do is reduce the amount of variation. Yeah? So this is to say, obviously the practitioner is important, the relationship has a role, and potentially having a program can perhaps add value to that. So it's not an either or.
Do the practitioners see that? Do they know who they are?
Gee, that's a really good question. I think it was shared with them because it was used as a part of kind of continuous improvement to see if you carry on practitioner 7 doing that, you're going to get a desk job. Yeah? Okay, another strategy that we might want to adopt is to better understand what seems to be the core elements of effective programs and which are the adaptable bits. As I've been around the kind of country trying to encourage people to use programs, I know that practitioners and managers want to be able to adapt. It's our human nature to want to make something suitable for our context. But what we don't know is which bits is it okay to change and which bits should be left untouched, because they seem to be the core ingredients. I think we, as a research community, could really help by saying, here's a great thing, leave these bits alone, but just adapt these as much as you want, because they'll actually create a sort of desire on the part of the practitioners to want to use this stuff. If we don't get pulled for these things, we're on a hiding to nothing. We need for practitioners to want to use these things rather than to feel that we're pushing them on managers and practitioners. So we can have a whole program of research better understanding what are the core ingredients and what are the things that just seem to increase the appeal of these programs. I think there's also some potential in this idea of kernels. I don't know if any of you have come across this. A guy called Dennis Embry is championing this. These tiny little interventions that practitioners could just incorporate into their daily practice that can be tried and tested. So they're not programs, they're not these big programs that you've got to kind of fit into a system. They're little practices that practitioners could adopt. I think there's a whole area for us to study there. And I'm pretty sure that the growing popularity and the reducing cost of wearables could actually also play an important role there. Lots of opportunities to test that. I think we haven't harnessed the potential of the public health approach, and by that I mean not always focusing our efforts down on the tail, the people with the extreme behaviours, but actually looking much more at what's going on for the average and trying to change the average with a view to that impacting upon the tail. And the example my colleague always gives is he used to spend a lot of time going between America and the UK, and would notice that if he went out for dinner in the US, he would never get offered a glass of wine. In the UK, you're into someone's house, you wouldn't just have one glass of wine, you'd have several. So the average person in the UK does tend to drink a bit more than the people in the US, but equally, in the US, they have fewer alcoholics proportionately. So we know there's a relationship between the behaviour of the average person and what's going on at the extreme. And we always tend to focus our efforts at the extreme. We could probably have a bit more impact if we thought more about how to change what's going on for the average. Those of you in schools probably know you get better impact on things like truancy by raising the standard for everybody than just focusing on those kids who are the persistent truants. Okay, seventh strategy. I think we could recast the role of the community when it comes to designing and implementing programs. We have this desire to sort of push programs onto communities. If we could sit down around the table and co-design and co-produce programs, we could probably come up with stuff that's far more appealing to families, has much more engagement, but also draws on the evidence rather than it being one or the other. So we're really interested in getting much smarter about how community members can be involved in this type of design work. And last, perhaps we could take a broader view of evidence. And this is what I want to finish my presentation on. I focus very much on the what works literature, what we know about what's effective from published research. And we tend to think that that's what constitutes evidence. I think there's and I think as Claire mentioned in her speech, there's different types of evidence that we need to use. And what we're interested in at Dartington is how you make that evidence useful to communities and system leaders. So I just want to end by giving you an example of something that we've done that we think is helping move things along in that regard. We have an approach called Better Evidence for a Better Start. And we start with the belief that we want to work in a local area. So this might be in a local government jurisdiction, it might be in a large community. And we want to get members of the community and members of public systems around the table together. We want them both engaged with the evidence to think about how they can improve outcomes for the children in their communities. So we start by spending quite a lot of time getting those people around the table, preparing them, getting them ready to go on a bit of an evidence journey. And the first thing we do is we try to persuade them of the value of investing in prevention and early intervention. That's not a case that's one for everybody. There's still, for some, need to be sort of walked through about why it might be a good idea to invest in prevention. And we use data that we've collected over the years that demonstrates our general inability to reach children with high levels of need with the services we provide. This is the case in the UK. we tend to really only scratch the surface when it comes to meeting the needs of children who have multiple needs. So we make the case for why it's worth investing in prevention, early intervention. We then look in local areas about how much money has actually been spent on children. And it's a really quite difficult question to ask. I'll say to a chief executive of the local authority, so how much has been spent on kids in this area? When you add up education spend, social care, mental health, community services, early years, nobody ever knows, because people only know what's going on in their little piece of the silo. We don't know what that total investment is in kids. And if we've got to use our money smarter, which we really have, we've got to get a sense of our total investment and how that's contributing to children's well-being, rather than focusing still on, I'm education, I'm mental health, I'm social care. People are always shocked by, A, how much there is, and who's responsible for it. Education have by far and away the largest piece of the pie, and we tend to not work with schools. It's a no-brainer. The next thing we do with this group is we get them to become much more familiar with what's going on for the children in their area. We gather data from families and from children using robust methods to chart the well-being of kids, how their health and development is doing, to help them to see how children are doing relative to other areas, relative to national norms, so they can actually prioritise 2 or 3 things that they want to try and make a difference to. And we also give them data about risk factors. Very happy to share. We have a data portal where all of this is available if any of you are interested. We try to visualise the data in a way that community members, system leaders can actually interact with it and have a play around with it. So we then we've given them evidence about what's going on for their children and their families. We've given them evidence about what money they're spending. We then provide them with evidence about what we seem to know works, and also what affects children's development, to try and inspire and inform innovations. And we try and pull that all together into a strategy which can be owned by community members and system leaders, which is about how they might spend their money differently to affect the things that they know are problems in their communities. So we use this approach in Scotland, in Perth and Kinross. I think I have seen that there are some people who've got Scottish heritage. So you might know where Perth and Kinross is. It's just above Glasgow and Edinburgh. And we worked with the chief executive of the local authority, directors of children's services, community members, parents. And by taking them through this process, they were willing to set aside £1 million to invest in prevention. And they wanted to move that from what they were spending on their, what they would call their deep end services, and gradually over time have a process by which money was taken from the deep end into prevention. £1 million. This is a small local authority, so this was a substantial investment. And it was from having gone through this process of really understanding the evidence and seeing what would be possible that they made that commitment. And I don't think any of this makes any difference if we can't change how people spend money in public systems. Yeah. So, I've taken you through a quick gamble, and I'm about to wrap up. So you don't even need to do this, Claire. So I started by giving you a sense of what the context is in the UK. It is pretty different. So a lot of these things may not apply, but I do think there's quite a lot of transferability. Tried to give you a sense of what the strengths and opportunities are from the existing what works literature, but set out some strategies that I think we need to pursue as researchers, as policymakers, as practitioners, and giving you a quick flavour of one method that brings all this together in a practical way for community members and system leaders. So I'm going to finish there. I'm very, very happy to take any questions or comments. You might want to do that by email. Very happy for you to drop me an email, or you could send me messages on Twitter, because I am trying to embrace the Twitter age. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to, yes.
If an organisation, an NGO, wants to go through that process with its own programs, do you think that's better done from within or without?
Can you explain what you mean by going through the process? Do you mean the evaluation process?
Yes, evaluating, delivery of a program and how it might be fine-tuned to...
So the question is, if you're an NGO, is it better to do this type of thing, this evaluation internally, or is there a point at which it's good to get external input? I would say that there's a lot that can be done internally that gets you to a certain point. And I think one of the things that is often overlooked is spending some time thinking about what you do and why you do it, and being very explicit about that. Quite often that feels like it's a missing piece when people do evaluation. They rush to gather data without that first step, and that doesn't need to cost anything. Sometimes it helps to have an outside person just come in and ask difficult questions, but you don't have to rush straight off to have these very expensive independent evaluations. But I do think there is a certain point where a degree of independence is necessary, because we're all vested in things that we've designed and delivered, and it's very difficult to accept that maybe we aren't making the impact. So at an appropriate moment, I think we do need outside people. I also think that universities, apologies to those of you who are from universities, don't do the best job at making evaluation affordable and possible for NGOs. So I think there's work to be done on both sides. Yes?
I think you said something quite important at the beginning. You said that evidence is only one thing which influences policy and practice. I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I would hate to have a world where we only look at the evidence to decide what we do. I think we need to take into account children's rights. Sometimes rights will trump evidence. We have a legal moral imperative. I think about some of the evaluations that have been done on child protection processes. They're not very effective, but none of us would stop having a child protection system for our young people. Sometimes consumer view needs to be the thing that's most important. If people really, really passionately want something, then perhaps that has to trump evidence. But in an ideal world, we can balance those four requirements and come to a more rational position. So evidence for me is very important, but it's by far and away not the most important or the only thing. Yes?
What do you do when decision makers want to implement? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. What do you do when decision makers want to implement known harmful interventions, despite the evidence that interventions are harmful?
The question, so what happens when people want to? Well, I think that we're an independent charity. The best we can do is make sure the evidence is understandable. I know that we have worked, when we've been engaged to work with a local authority or with a philanthropic body, I think some people are just quite amazed to believe that we can do harm. We find it really hard to believe that well-intentioned activities can be harmful. So we try to explain that, but there's only a limit to how far you can go as an independent centre. It happens all the time. Yeah. Those things that don't work seem to be the things that get scaled most, ironically. Yes?
Hi. So I'm interested in if you had any pushback around doing randomised controlled trials in schools and how you approach that.
So the question is, have we had any pushback about doing randomised controlled trials in schools? Well, when we first started doing trials, which was about 8 years ago, we were treated like pariahs. We really were very unpopular, and it was deemed to be utterly inappropriate. There has been a shift, and I think even in schools, there's an acceptance that it's quite helpful to find out whether things do work or not. I think once we get past the idea that we're going to deny children something, so that what you're comparing to is current services and what you're adding is something in addition, then a lot of the ethical concerns do subside. So things have shifted and there is a greater interest. And in most cases what we're saying is, if this is effective, you will be the first schools to receive this intervention if you're in the control group.
Right.
So it's like a waitlist control.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, when we were trying to recruit for the PATH study, we couldn't get any schools to participate. We were thinking, oh my goodness, we've got to do a randomised control trial. Not a single school wants to get involved. And then we enlisted the services of a former head teacher. And within a month and a half, we had 60 schools. So we learned a very important lesson about how you need to get peers to talk to peers to do stuff like this. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any observations. You were talking about 30% cuts and austerity and so forth. Has that changed the willingness of parties in the UK to actually stop ineffective programs? It's
such a great question. I've spent 17 years trying to encourage people to use evidence-informed interventions, and I've always been struck about how much we struggle to stop doing things. Decommissioning is probably the biggest challenge I've ever faced, and even in an environment of the cuts of 30%, still we're holding on to stuff. So the cuts aren't that logical. It'll be a sort of a knife through this service and it will just go, rather than a more rational consideration of what seems to work. So I think it's the single biggest challenge we face, to be able to, if we're having to make cuts, to do that in a more systematic, evidence-based way. I'm sorry, I wish I could be more optimistic or positive. I've got a few questions, so if I go here and then here.
In addition to that, so what are the criteria you would use to reprioritize, if there's a
Sure.
funding cut?
So the question is, how might you go about that? Well, I think actually it's more fair to be transparent and have a series of questions that you're asking of services than just cuts that seem to be random. And I do think that you can develop not even a criteria, because that probably feels a little bit black and white, but asking services, well, who do you serve? What's your rationale? What do you believe you're achieving? And perhaps you find out that there are 3 services doing pretty much the same thing. So there's duplication, and there's a case for reducing there. I think in Renfrewshire, which is one of the other authorities we work with, they took that the furthest, and they did develop a sort of criteria where they tried to get services to be a bit more explicit about what they were doing and use that as a basis to try and decommission. But then perhaps politicians will get involved and go, nope, I'm not having that service cut. So all your logical steps go out the window. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks Louise, very helpful, thank you. The question is around whether or not you've done any work on collaborative practice and the value or not of 2, 3, 4 agencies working together with complementary services.
Can you elaborate the question a bit more?
So there's a bit of a focus here on collaborative,
yes.
Working collaboratively. So you'd have a client, who has 3 or 4 services provided by 3 or 4 different organisations towards certain agreed outcomes, and whether or not you've done any work around that.
No.
That concept?
No,
okay.
no. I think most of our recent experience is in trying to bring the community perspective into this rather than bringing multiple providers together.
Right.
So, no, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah.
At the back.
You mentioned at the start that you worked in a ethnically diverse community. Do you have any insights, comments on what you did in order to address diversity?
Sure. Well, I suppose the first question was, in Birmingham, where we were using, for example, the Incredible Years programme, was this suitable to Muslim women because of the large population of Muslim women? And it was a very legitimate question, and we found that there were certain things that it was useful to adapt. For example, just helping staff to be much more culturally aware of, you can't have a male facilitator, for example. The day of the week that the groups were run on, the times of the day. So there were some very basic cultural sensitivities that it was helpful to bring in. But actually, the core of the programme, the parents' view was the core mattered because they were parents, and the fact that they were parents was the most important thing. So the process was having those potential consumers round the table to look at the programme, for them to give their view on the cultural acceptability of that intervention. And we kind of went with that. I don't think we're by any means experts in knowing how to make sensitive cultural adaptation, but I think we had a good process by which the people who are the experts were able to contribute. And when we tested the intervention, it seemed to work as well for our Muslim women as it had done for our white women. So that would be my sense. Yes?
One of the important things you raised, I think, was the quality of the evaluation.
Yes.
How do you do it? Is that something you see external peer review or some kind of framework, assessment framework that you've got in advance? What's the way you achieve that best?
Sure. So the question is about the quality of evaluation. I suppose the first step is if someone comes to us and says, we've got this fantastic intervention, we think it should be on your database. The first thing we want to look at is what types of evaluations have been done. And I think there is a risk that people go, well, it's a randomised control trial, so that ticks the box. But you can have a badly done randomised control trial, and you can have a really well done pre- and post-test design. So we have quite a comprehensive set of criteria. that we would appraise for any study before we look at whether we feel we can tick that box to say that the evaluation quality was good. But I'd be very happy, we've got a big book about it, I'd be very happy to send it to you. But yeah, it's a great question, thank you.
Is that on your website?
Yeah. Yes.
I was busy taking notes and just saw the tail end of a slide which I think showed that only about 8% of children with multiple need, came to notice? Or
Sure, let me go back to that.
Could you explain
Sure,
that one
of
a
course.
little further?
Yeah, of course. So those of you who were at the workshop in Auckland yesterday will participated in an exercise. What we asked people to do was to draw a big circle. The outer circle represents all children in your community. The red circle is the proportion of those children who have multiple needs. And so how we have arrived at that is by using epidemiological data. So we go into a community, we survey representative population, and we look at the outcomes and the risk factors and can set a threshold. So it's a bit arbitrary. We've set 6 as the threshold. 6 needs that a child has would put them into that multiple need category. We generally find that the multiple need circle ranges between about 16 and 24% in different communities that we go to. And then what we're able to do is we link administrative data at the child level. So children participate in the survey, and we can then link data from social care, from education, if we're lucky from health. And we can determine what proportion of those children have received specialist services. So the 3 things that generally shock people are the size of this circle, it's larger than most people expect. The size of this circle, it's smaller than most people expect. But most importantly, the level of overlap. We all think that this circle will be inside this circle.
Yeah.
So this was the moment when the chief executive from the Scottish Authority said, this is really risky for us. There is so much need here that we're not reaching. And what she wanted to do was to try and invest in making the red circle smaller. So she wanted to see investment in prevention. So that's good. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned something about the cost of evaluation being a barrier.
Yeah.
Can you sort of comment on that a bit more?
Sure. So when we did the evaluations in Birmingham and we said we were going to do 3 randomised control trials, I think if you went to, and again, sorry for those of you from universities, if you got a quote for 3 randomised control trials from a university, you'd be talking well in excess of $1 million. So we set ourselves a challenge of whether it's possible to do a good quality of a randomised control trial much more affordably by really stripping down the amount of data that's collected. So that was how we approached it, and I think it's incumbent upon researchers to work out ways of doing high quality evaluation but much more affordably. And I think there's great opportunities from administrative data to be able to do, and the Behavioural Insights Unit in the UK is doing some nice work on randomised control trials using administrative data. So I think we, as researchers, we've just got to become a little bit more creative about being able to do high quality evaluation but get the cost down, because it puts people off, understandably. Yes?
What's your experience with doing what some people call developmental evaluation? And you know, do you have a sort of a way of thinking about what's the right proportion of developmental versus exposed evaluation?
Sure. So the question is, what do we think about developmental evaluation? If I've understood what you mean correctly, we like to think about any sort of program or intervention going along a sort of pipeline, right from the idea, the innovation, through to when you're going to try and take something to scale. And that at each point on that pipeline, there's an appropriate and proportionate approach to evaluation. And it really relates to the question that you asked about early on. The evaluation actually should be probably internal. It's more about thinking about the theory, gathering a small amount of good quality data about what you're implementing. And then really quite a long way down the line, getting to inviting external objective scrutiny through things like trials. I think there's another opportunity for us to develop some new methods there. I was talking to some statisticians at a trials unit where they're looking at what's been happening in the drugs world, where randomised control trials allow for the innovation to be constantly changed and the trial continues. I think we need to be looking at that. That means that you don't have to wait 5 years to get your trial to find out that the thing you're evaluating is actually quite different 5 years later. So trials that take that long, I think, probably become rather redundant, because it's like looking in the rear view mirror rather than looking through the windscreen, because you're looking at what you did a few years back. So yeah, I think academics and researchers have got a lot to do here. Is that the right answer?
I'm not an expert, but I have seen some very good examples of that learn and build type model, and I just think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, I also don't think we make enough use of the existing literature, not of individual programs, but things like systematic reviews to inform our design work. I think we tend to like to start with a blank piece of paper. I think we could use a lot more from the evidence as we're designing interventions and programs. Over there, yes.
Sorry.
So no, I was lady behind you and then you.
My question relates to decommissioning.
Yeah.
And you talked about it's really important to be transparent and ask a similar set of questions. One of the comments I frequently hear, particularly from community groups, is that the funder, who sometimes in New Zealand is also a provider of services, doesn't ask themselves the same questions that they're asking of the people they contract with. So a recent example was a district health board was asking a local provider of services lots of questions about their bed nights and services. And when that community said to the DHB, well, you tell me what your results are, they couldn't answer it. So have you found that in your communities, and how have you gone about getting some buy-in so that we, government challenges itself to ask the same questions as it's asking the people it's contracting with?
I completely agree. It's quite common for local authorities to apply one set of criteria to those organisations who they are paying to provide certain services, yet at the same time will be providing services and not ask that question. I haven't got an answer. I agree with you completely that I would always be trying to encourage a level playing field, and that you're applying the same criteria to your contractors or your providers as to your own. I think that when we manage to get an organisation to go through the process I outlined there, those would be the sorts of things that would come into the mix of the conversation pretty early on. And with the community members around the table, that does help to force that on. When I talk about community, I mean not only people who are representing provider organisations, but residents and parents. So they provide quite an interesting challenge to system leaders and sort of provide that sort of disruption to ask those questions. But there has to be a willingness to do the process in the first place. So I agree with you completely. It's a great point. Yes?
Sorry. I just, with the collection and the use of the administrative data you've got on the screen there, across the different services, care data aside, have you had any kind of legal or kind of privacy concerns about actually doing that work?
We had an absolute media storm about doing this. And it wasn't because we'd done anything wrong. We'd sought all the right permissions about confidentiality and anonymity, and the Children's Commissioner was supportive. But we had two parents who used Twitter incredibly effectively to put in freedom of information requests to every branch of government, every local authority, and actually those two, and it was two parents, caused the ministers to terminate our contract. So although we'd done nothing wrong, it was very potent because it's such a sensitive subject. So it's not just about technically getting it right, it's also being able to take people along that this is a sensitive and appropriate use of data. So we had learned a very, very serious lesson about how to do this, not only technically, but how you communicate what you're doing. So very happy to share that, because I wouldn't want any of you to go through what we went through. Yeah.
Last question.
What do you feel the optimal whole of budget proportion for evaluations?
Ooh, well, I've come from a research centre, so I don't know. I mean, if someone comes to us and says, we're about to put in an application for, say, a £2 million grant, will you do the evaluation? And I say, how much are you going to set aside? And they say 20,000. I say, well, I think you probably want to go somewhere else. I do think that you want to be looking at between 5 and 10%. If it's a substantial investment, if it's something that really hasn't been tried and tested before. so between 5 and 10%. But that feels a little arbitrary. I'm going to be quoted on that. Wish I hadn't said it.
Okay, Louise, thank you very much
Welcome.
for sharing with us. You've made a into this, and can you hear me? You've made a great start to our conference and set the tone for where we go next. And as we move through the day, being able to take some of what Louise has shared with us and think about that in terms of the New Zealand context and what this means for us as we work through some of the presentations and some of the breakout sessions. So thank you very much. I've had the pleasure of being able to travel with her at the moment, as well as we've done the workshops in Auckland and then one tomorrow in Christchurch, and I can say that I've picked her brain. She's a lovely woman, as well as being a fantastic researcher and very clever in what they're doing. So I ask you again to thank Louise for